members of the majority party are using a procedure to push forward legislation that their own party's leadership has otherwise stalled.
Because the parties simply don't support singular leadership as they might have decades ago.
Republicans hold a razor-thin majority.
And it just becomes like a whack-a-mole nightmare, right? When you have a narrow majority that's that narrow and that precarious, because these politicians simply don't have the same legislative and or electoral incentives that members of the party did 20 or 30 years ago.
Hey there, welcome to the Decision Desk HQ Podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Skelly, the Chief Elections Analyst at DDHQ. This week, we're going to talk about the messy state of affairs in the United States House of Representatives. There, Republicans hold a razor-thin majority of 218 to 213. There are 4 vacancies. So thin, in fact, that majority, that a few absences in recent days have at times left Democrats with actually more voting members on the House floor than Republicans had. Throughout this Congress, Republican Speaker Mike Johnson has had to navigate a number of internal conflicts within the Republican House Conference on a number of issues, all with this very slim majority. And it hasn't necessarily gone well, would I think be the broad takeaway if you're trying to simplify it. He's found himself butting heads with fellow Republicans, including a revolt by some moderates to support healthcare legislation that was supported by Democrats, and a revolt by some conservatives to support the release of the Epstein files. So over and over again, his power has been challenged, including with an increase in the use of discharge petitions by members of his own party, the Republicans, which is to say that members of the majority party are using a procedure to push forward legislation that their own party's leadership has otherwise stalled. This is all this has happened and contributed to a moment of reduced influence for the House. Congress's lower chamber has been something of a bystander as President Trump flexes and attempts to expand his executive power, and the U.S. Senate directs the course of major legislation more so than the House. So with kind of all this mess going on in the House, I am thrilled to be joined by Joshua Huder, a senior fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University. Josh has studied the internal procedures and the politics of the House over time. He even has his own Substack newsletter, Seat of Democracy, where he explores what's going on in congressional politics, past and present. And he also hosts the podcast Congress, 2 Beers In. And so with that, Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jeffrey. Happy to be here.
Hey, well, this is great. Obviously, for people watching politics, the sort of conflict within the House has been a major story for a while now, and I think it's perhaps reached a particularly a particular high point maybe in the last couple of weeks. Republicans lost Marjorie Taylor Greene; she resigned from the House in early January, and then the untimely death of Representative Doug LaMalfa from California further narrowed the Republican numbers to 218. And this is with the prospect of a Democrat getting elected at the end of the month from a special election in Texas. And so you'd be talking about a 218 to 214 majority. And so for Mike Johnson to move anything forward on the floor, he needs full attendance for one thing. And he also needs pretty much near unanimity to do so. So things have been difficult, but at the same time, he has found himself, it seems like, in sort of consistent conflict in trying to manage the caucus. And so kind of with an eye on something you wrote recently about him being a broker or in a czar's body or a leader's body in terms of sort of understanding speakership politics over time, I thought it'd be great if you could sort of set the scene for listeners and viewers.
Yeah, I mean, the references to like being a broker and being a czar really harken back to like previous eras of lawmaking, right? So during the turn of the 20th century, you had really, really strong, powerful speakers. You had Speaker Reed, Speaker Henderson, Speaker Cannon, and these members were known for being basically tyrants, right? They were called czars because they accumulated so much institutional power that they dominated the institution. I mean, they dominated people's careers in the institution. They affected what committee you sat on. They affected your political odds. I mean, they could make or break you almost single-handedly. It was an extraordinarily powerful institution. People got sick of that. They got very, very tired of having to deal with these extraordinarily powerful leaders that just kind of like at their whim would kind of ruin their lives, careers, legislative prospects, whatever. So the House changed the speakership dramatically to much more of a brokering type of position around 1910, 1911. And since then, like you find different styles of speakership, right? Speaker Longworth and Speaker Rayburn were far more of a broker, right? They weren't the ones orchestrating everything or literally like directing what was going to happen. They were structuring deals between very powerful members in the House. So they weren't telling the House what to do. They were sort of like trying to massage what the House was going to do based on all the different things that all of their members wanted to do. It was much more of a negotiating position rather than a dictating position. Now, the modern speakership is closer to the czars, right? It's a very, very powerful institution. And the modern speakership is sort of like the fulcrum around which the majority revolves around, right? And you have to remember, this is an institution that was built around a time when the parties were becoming much more ideologically consistent. So the reason the speakership is so powerful today is because you had very ideologically more consistent parties growing more consistent in the 1980s and the 1990s, the 1970s, and into the 2000s. So these parties, like Democrats, were becoming more liberal during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The Republicans were becoming more consistently conservative in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So parties went from being this huge hodgepodge of ideological mismatch to kind of pretty consistent. Like liberals were in the Democratic Party, conservatives were in the Republican Party. And as that political transition occurred, they made the speakership much more powerful as legislative politics became much more partisan. And so today we still have that institution. It's still extremely, extremely powerful, and it's worked for a while. But we're also seeing it not work today, right? And then recently we've seen speakers really struggle to get much done because the parties are starting to pull apart from one another again. And so when I say he's a broker in czar's clothes, he has all the institutional powers of a czar speaker, but he doesn't have the politics that really support that kind of leadership. And so he's in a position of trying to speak as a singular leader for the entire Republican conference when really nobody can do that. The Republican conference has become so fragmented that one person can't speak for everybody, right? Nobody can speak for Brian Fitzpatrick and Chip Roy at the same time because they're just totally different members with totally different legislative goals, political goals. They are phenomenally different. They operate in different political universes. And so it's really kind of a weird spot. It's like he has not realized that he should not be speaking for everybody, right? He needs to sort of take his hands off the wheel a little bit, if you would. But institutions are institutions and people are people, and powerful people are always interested in power. So it's not something that speakers have willingly given up before. But wielding that power in today's legislative climate is extremely difficult because the parties simply don't support singular leadership as they might have decades ago.
Right. And I think it's worth, harkening back to the start of this Congress just to remind people, I'm going to bring up a chart here for folks who are watching this, but that was in a piece I put together early in 2025. And it was basically Mike Johnson won the speakership with no room to spare. Republicans were elected with a 220 to 215 majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so it was very slim. He needed Republicans to get behind him. And President Trump helped with that during that process. But even then, at the start of the Congress, you had Republicans actually at 219 seats because Matt Gaetz resigned, essentially. And Republicans were just in a position where to elect a speaker, they had to basically all agree, or nearly all agree. And so at the end of the day, Mike Johnson was elected speaker, but with 0 votes to spare, which was a new thing. Now, it didn't take multiple ballots for him, but it did speak to sort of, there was this famous pause. They left the vote open for a very long time to make
4 hours
to make the deal.
It's not really multiple ballots, but it's kind of multiple.
It was kind of multiple
right?
ballots. It was multiple ballots and everything, but name or official formally. Nonetheless, that it just I think sort of speaks to the difficult position he was in to begin with. And obviously the narrow majority plays into it. But as you said, and something I think I'd love to hear you elucidate on is sort of the internal politics of the Republican Party and how that is making it difficult for Johnson to manage things, to be a czar.
Right. Well, the parties have been sort of fracturing for a little while now, and this has to do with the kind of populist strand of politics that is affecting both parties, really. Um, You've seen this with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is certainly not the first person to introduce this, though. This has been within the Republican Party and increasingly within the Democratic Party for quite some time now. People are frustrated with the parties, and so they're looking for outsiders, right? Whether that's, the Freedom Caucus types over on the Republican side of the aisle, or whether it's the sort of very progressive members like the AOCs and the Rashida Tlaibs on the Democratic side of the aisle. They're looking for somebody who's going to kind of break through the establishment, and it's sort of just an angst that's been going on. That said, what's been affecting the Republican Party is a little bit populist and also a little bit not, right? We've had a conservative movement within the Republican Party for a very, very long time. And arguably, it's what the animus behind everything that's been going on for the last 30 years in Republican politics. Newt Gingrich arose to the leadership of the Republican Party based on a kind of anti-establishment populist message. He was the outsider. He ousted the Republican leader and eventually became Speaker of the House. Well, once Newt Gingrich was in charge for 4 years, people said he's too much of the establishment and we need to find some new blood. And so what ended up happening, they had a little bit of a coup. They kicked out Newt Gingrich on some very kind of fragile scandals. Were bad, but like not necessarily the thing you typically see somebody leave office for. One of the leaders of that particular coup was a guy named John Boehner, who'll come back in a little bit and we'll talk about. But you see him get toppled, and you have Dennis Hastert. Dennis Hastert goes away. Republicans elect John Boehner, the same guy who led the coup against Gingrich, all of a sudden becomes part of the establishment. They kick it. The Freedom Caucus kicks out John Boehner. They pluck Paul Ryan out of obscurity to put him in there. He gets tossed out as well. I mean, this is a recurring theme, right? Republicans are sort of after the most conservative member to lead the party, as if that's going to fix the party somehow. But once they're in the leadership, they have leadership problems. They have to represent all of the members. And frankly, it's just not possible, right? You can't represent all of the members and be the most conservative member of the House of Representatives. It's just not humanly possible. So this kind of like conservative animus has really framed conservative leadership and Republican leadership for a long time. And it's going on 30 years now. You can call that populist or not, but really it's kind of like the conservative movement taking hold of the institution in a really, really profound way. And we're seeing similar things happen over on the Democratic side of the aisle. Nancy Pelosi really struggled with AOC, Tlaib, Omar, Jeff Bowman, Cori Bush. Like they opposed her on really important bills like the budget to introduce the Build Back Better plan, like President Biden's signature achievement. So this has been going on for quite some time. And so while it's populist as well, right, you could also talk about sort of the kind of structural weakness of the parties at the moment. And the reality is the parties are very good at getting people elected when they focus on an election, right? But the thing is, they don't focus on all elections, right? It doesn't make sense to waste money on a safe seat in Georgia, for example, or a safe seat in New York, if those seats are going to be Democratic or Republican, no matter who gets nominated to the position. And so they sort of take their eye off the ball in many of these districts, and this has allowed a lot of kind of anti-establishment politicians to win nomination to very important seats. And this has increasingly happened in safe seats. And so you see people like Chip Roy, Ralph Norman, Tim Burchett, AOC, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, all of these sort of like oppositional party candidates winning nomination to these safe seats. And then once they're in Congress, it's not a surprise that they don't play ball, right? They just spent an entire electoral cycle fighting the Democratic or Republican establishment. And so when the Democratic or Republican establishment comes to them for a vote, like, hey, we could really use you on this one, it's like, oh no, you're going to take away my campaign funds? It's not like you were helping me before. In fact, you were my opponent, right? You were trying to get me unelected or not elected or not nominated. So you have this real big tension right now. You have a lot of anti-establishment politics, and it's weakened the parties both outside in terms of their control over nominations to the party and inside. Once they get into Congress, they're less likely to work with the party because the party has fewer sticks and carrots to reward or punish those members for being unorthodox in their legislative behavior. So It's really kind of a double-edged sword here. And it's making kind of traditional politics, as we've known it for the last 50 years, fray and become more difficult because these politicians simply don't have the same legislative and or electoral incentives that members of the party did 20 or 30 years ago.
Well, that's a really fascinating way of sort of looking at things. The point of not being able to put, not pouring resources into a safe seat, particularly because we've lived in a really competitive period here, where each party has a pretty realistic shot of taking power, and you have a run of very close presidential elections, sort of the House and seesawing back and forth, especially in the first midterm for a new president in particular. There's been a habit of that happening, and so you want to pour your resources into those marginal seats that are going to be highly competitive, that are going to give you the opportunity to be in the majority, but at the same time, you end up with maybe more anti-establishment members getting elected from safer seats, and then they butt heads with the members from the more marginal seats who are very worried about reelection, not so much renomination. They're worried about reelection, and if they're sort of pushed into taking more extreme positions on certain votes or certain legislation, that's not good for them politically. And so, that I think brings me to maybe a recent example of this, which is like the we'll start talking about discharge petitions here. The Epstein files were a thing where Democrats were supporting their release. They want to try to embarrass the Trump administration, but you get a few Republicans to sign on to an effort to get around basically Republican leadership halting that or stalling that effort, and that is, the fact that you would have some Republicans buck party leadership to go along with Democrats on something, what sort of regardless of the subject matter, to push forward a type of legislation, is striking, because I mean, we don't live, it's not a very bipartisan age here, but here you have this kind of weird bipartisanship, but at the same time it's sort of to circumvent the party leadership. And so I was wondering if you'd speak on that for a minute. I think I want to bring up, actually, before we do, a chart from Matthew Green, who's a political scientist at Catholic University, who helps run the Mischiefs of Faction Substack. Very, very fun to read about, very, very illuminating, and basically talking about the thing you want to look on this chart if you're watching is the far end, right end of this chart, which is the blue line, which is the percentage of discharge petitions introduced by majority members. So you have members of the Republican majority who want to get certain things to the floor that they feel like the House leadership is blocking them from doing, and they are trying to find a workaround, which is a discharge petition, which is a procedure to basically get a majority of the House to sign on to it, and then you can sort of work your way around and get something moving forward in terms of legislation. And so you have this sudden increase in the number of Republicans who are introducing discharge petitions, which would seem to suggest that they don't think leadership is getting getting the stuff that they want out.
Right.
And so I'd love to hear sort of your interpretation of what's been going on there, because this would seem to really indicate some of that internal fight going on, especially within the Republican majority right now.
Yeah, and Matt Green is a great political scientist and a good friend of mine, so I'm not surprised that he hit this one on the head. But what's interesting about discharge petitions is not just the frequency of their success this Congress. I think we've had maybe five discharge petitions this Congress that have reached 218 signatures. It's how those signatures are coming about, right? And this is what really speaks to kind of like frailty of Republican leadership at the current moment. When we were talking just a little bit ago about the kind of emphasis and resources that parties put into congressional districts in order to win those nominations and kind of like help that quality candidate emerge to the general election. This is research by Hans Hassel, by the way, down at FSU, brilliant political scientist. But one of the things that's really interesting about this is that discharge petitions have actually had it's not been a stable coalition that's been introducing these things. These things have come from sort of like all over the place. So on the one hand, you've had discharge petitions like allowing paternal and maternal leave for members of Congress to be able to vote remotely while they're nursing a newborn, for example. This is not something that House rules allow. Proxy voting has been banned since the pandemic. But members would like new mothers to be able to take some leave and be able to vote remotely while they're, postpartum.
And I believe that was Republican Anna Luna who was pushing
That's
that.
right. Yeah.
Yes, from
And
Florida.
there were a lot of conservatives that signed on to that. People like, Tim Burchett, for example. And I'm not surprised that those members did, because again, the party's not really helping them win nomination, right? They're winning nomination to their seats because they're the most conservative, right? And they don't have they don't need massive funds in order to win that. They just do it by being the most conservative member in a large primary field. But what's interesting more recently are the moderates who are bucking the leadership. And that is because the moderates, they kind of get this bad rap for being the first to fold, right? They're the weakest. They're the ones with loud in the spine or whatever. They're also the ones with the most to lose when it comes to the dedication of campaign resources. Like Brian Fitzpatrick relies a lot, like Representative LaLota in New York relies a lot on the party to raise funds for them so that they can win nomination and therefore win this very precariously positioned seat in the general election. And what we've seen recently are those exact members bucking the leadership on a variety of different things, right? Whether it's the ACA subsidies or labor legislation that has come to the floor under a discharge petition. Just yesterday, they killed a rule that was bringing labor legislation to the floor, and they had to pull two other bills because those same group of members who have kind of like pretty labor-friendly districts bucked the party on them. This has been a kind of stunning rebuke of the leadership and the leadership scheduling. So it's not just that like it's coming from one particular spot, right? You're kind of like troublemakers have always been on the right flank. They've been the Freedom Caucus. They've been the most conservative members. Well, we're seeing the moderates start to rebel as well. Right. And not just that, you hear a lot of angst coming from the rank and file, like Elise Stefanik is throwing the speaker under the bus. You have other members when the speaker recessed the House for 7 weeks, they're just talking about how terrible this is and how awful like what they're doing and how they don't agree with it and how they should be voting. They've really managed to alienate a large swath of the conference, and that's just never a good position to be in. So on the one hand, like, yeah, you're in a really tough spot. On the other hand, the way they've used their power in this particular Congress has been pretty misguided, and I think they've lost the trust of a lot of the conference as well. And that's indicative when you see the kind of like coalitions that are forming in order to make this kind of historic run of discharge petitions happen.
I wonder, just thinking about the fact that Johnson was Republicans have a very narrow majority, and Mike Johnson was elected speaker, barely, and holding a vote open for many hours in order to make it possible and negotiate to help make that happen. And
don't forget, it took him 4 ballots on this when he was originally
right, exactly. I mean, it's worth remembering that the last
118.
guy, Kevin McCarthy, got pushed out by a motion to vacate by 8 particularly hardline members, or mostly hardline members, and were ready to push McCarthy out, and did so. And Johnson ended up being kind of the last man standing after there were other people who led on leadership ballots on the Republican side.
He was the fourth nominee after 3 other failed nominees, right?
Yeah, it was quite the funny side story. I was actually, so McCarthy, it took him a number of ballots, I think 6 or 7 to get elected originally in early 2023 or whatever it was. It was a lot. I don't
12 or 13. I forget.
Maybe it was 13. Yes, thank you. Sorry. I think I was thinking about when some of the holdouts were starting to come home. It took like that many ballots.
Yes.
I was on my honeymoon. And so I didn't get to experience that. So I was really thankful. And as somebody who nerds out over this stuff, it was really fascinating to watch. The Republican conference was nice enough to kick out McCarthy and give me a second shot at that. In the speakership battle in October of 23, and Mike Johnson ends up being speaker. And so I guess actually a thing I wanted to ask you about was, where does this leave Johnson in terms of leading the House and potential threats to him holding on to the speakership? Or is it just because with such a narrow majority, and also we'll talk about this in a second, but sort of letting the White House and the Senate sort of run the show, are Republicans like, well, if we open this up, it'll just be even more of a mess than it already is?
Right. So, I mean, it's a multi-front thing, right? It's not just the narrow majority. Narrow majorities are a nightmare, right? Let's just get that out of the way. They're an absolute nightmare. When you're talking about a vote advantage currently of 217 because we have a member who's absent because he's been injured in a car crash, you have a two vote threshold, right? So any member and a friend can just make your life miserable, right? They can stop everything that you want to do. And so what you have to do is you have to talk to them, negotiate. What do you need? What do you want? What can I give you? Except in giving them what they want, you may lose four others on the other side, right? And it just becomes like a whack-a-mole nightmare, right? When you have a narrow majority that's narrow and that precarious, right? So that's one part of it, right? The second part of it is Johnson's actually lost control of the institution, right? He says he has control of the institution, but that's not really true. And it's not true because he doesn't really have control over the Rules Committee to a substantial degree, right? Now, the Rules Committee is a vital committee. We have a bunch of procedures in the House, but one of the kind of like core elements of getting to a vote in the House is you actually have to take a vote in order to get to a bill, right? So in order to bring a bill to the floor, even debate it, vote it, all that fun stuff, you need to get a vote in order to do those things. So first you vote to bring it to the floor, and then you vote to pass it. Now, bringing a vote to the floor involves the Rules Committee, and this is a committee that's been dominated by the Speaker because the Speaker appoints members to it. And that's been the case since 1975. He appoints all 9 majority members to that particular committee. But the last couple of Congresses, he's had to give up 3 of those seats. And so he functionally is picking 6, and then he has to put 3 conservatives who don't really agree with him on that panel. Catch is, if 3 conservatives vote with the 4 minority members on the Democratic side of the aisle, all of a sudden Mike Johnson no longer has a majority in the committee that brings bills to the floor. This is a huge problem. And it's been you've seen it kind of play out in other ways. This is not like a big story. It's really hard to nail down because it's all closed behind closed doors, but you can find evidence of it in the bills that do come to the floor or the bills that don't make it to the floor unless they're significantly changed, right? So one example was the National Defense Authorization Act. This is always a massively bipartisan piece of legislation. This could not get to the floor in the House of Representatives, despite the fact that it was reported out of the committee, 60 votes to 1, right? Enormously bipartisan, until they made 3 major changes with a bunch of poison pill conservative amendments to it, right? Then it passed the House with 221 votes or something like that, right? That's the type of change where you would say, like, maybe they're not totally in control of the committee because they wanted to bring it to the floor, but then they had to pull it until they had to negotiate more with conservatives on the panel. You're seeing the same sort of thing play out with spending bills. You saw this play out with Ukraine legislation last year, where Republicans on the committee had to work with Democrats on the committee in order to bring omnibus bills to the floor, spending bills, Ukraine aid. It was a nightmare for the Speaker. In this Congress, I think what you're seeing is sort of Speaker like really kind of losing the committee to a significant degree. And that's not something that we've seen since the 1970s, honestly. And so it's really kind of stark. On the one hand, he's got a narrow majority, and that's a nightmare. On the other hand, he's lacking the kind of normal tools that a speaker would have in order to negotiate and manage that majority. So that's another thing. And then the final thing that's really causing major problems with this is the fact that he's lost his procedural majority, right? This is a sort of a concept where Republicans, even if you oppose the bill, you vote for the processes necessary to pass the bill, right? So if you're going to bring, for example, a labor bill to the floor and you can't vote for that labor bill, you still vote to bring the bill to the floor so that your majority can do what they want to do. That's gone, right? And it's a kind of a nightmare for Johnson because he loses special rules, which are those votes to bring bills to the floor. He's lost the ability to really control his conference. He can't really control the agenda in the same way. So he's lost the committee that controls the votes to the floor significantly. His power is really compromised there. He's lost the ability to ratify the agreements he is able to manage in the committee once he gets to the floor. And all of this is kind of like goes back to the fact that he has a very slim majority and he's trying to govern on a partisan basis, right? We've had slim majorities in the past. The last one was 1931, where for a second, like we were actually tied, right? Just for a hot moment. But the difference between 1931 politics and today's politics are so fundamentally different. You had a slim majority in 1931. Sure, that complicated things, but you also expected the Congress to work in a bipartisan fashion on most issues. That was an extraordinarily bipartisan Congress. Democrats, Republicans working together on a lot of things. Today, we've sort of thrown away the bipartisan politics, right, to a significant degree. And this is problematic because even today, when we're making laws, they do it in a bipartisan fashion, right? It's sort of a choice. Not all legislation is passed on a, not all lawmaking is done on a partisan basis. In fact, those are the exceptions to the rule, right? The reconciliation bills are partisan bills, but those are really exceptions to an otherwise very bipartisan lawmaking process that exists even today, right? 60 to 70% of the bills that become law are bipartisan, significantly bipartisan on first passage, right? So that tells you like they're still working together. It doesn't get a lot of the press that it needs, but they're still working together. And so when you're trying to do this on a very partisan basis, yeah, if you only have 217 votes to work with and you insist on only using those 217 Republicans, it's going to cause problems, right? Um, they could go in another bipartisan route, but then again, you're starting to risk your political foundation there when you start working with Democrats for really regularly and you're in control of the institution, or quote unquote in control of the institution. So this is the conundrum that he's in. I mean, you're seeing a variety of fronts in which his power is being challenged or outright broken. And it's partly to do with the slim majority. It's partly to do with the decisions of the leadership. And it's partly to do with the fact that polarization does have an impact on how members of the majority want to govern.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up because you mentioned the smallest majority the the after the 1930 election, and so at the start of the Congress, this chart's actually from the start of the Congress. So again, as you pointed out, Republicans down to 218 votes and then 217 because they have a member who's out. So this is where like absences and sickness and a car accident can really affect things. So it was like just in recent times, the fact that Republicans started basically when the House opened, there were 219 Republicans in a vacancy in a Republican leaning seat. And that's one more than they needed for the outright majority in order to pass anything. That gives you so little room to spare and room to maneuver. And knowing, as you pointed out, the politics of the moment, in the early 1930s, you have the two parties, but there's more regional splits. They're more ideologically diverse. You have factions within them that can actually find common cause with a faction from the other party, and you don't have that now in the same way. And so in order to get anything done, you need to have that backing from your membership. But as you pointed out, with if they can't even move bills forward because now Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania is not going to vote for something, or someone else is going to say, well, I don't want to bring that to the floor or even go along with leadership on this. It's sort of like how do you govern?
Right. Well, I mean, this has been a sort of change in norms, right? Legislative norms in particular. The way in which you go about lawmaking has changed even within the last 10 years, right? There was a really famous quote unquote rule back in the day. It's called the Hastert rule, right? And that was the notion that you don't bring bills to the floor that a majority of the majority party does not approve, right? So that's like, okay, well, that sounds like, oh, it's kind of hostile, right? And according to previous eras of lawmaking, it was, right? Previous eras, like decades before Hastert, it was fairly common for a bill to come to the floor where a majority of the majority party did not necessarily support that. Why? Because you had a bunch of coalitions within the Democratic Party who were willing to work with conservatives, particularly Southern Democrats. And so it wasn't that uncommon. We get to Hastert, and then the Hastert rule becomes like this kind of like, oh my gosh, this shock moment when he recognizes that I work for the majority party and we don't bring bills to the floor that a majority of my party does not support, right? That becomes a quote unquote rule. It's not actually a rule. It's just a legislative practice, right? This is just good legislative practices for a partisan leader in a House majority. Now, that's actually a really low bar compared to today's standard, right? If you needed a bill that got a majority of the majority party, well, that's a lot of legislation, right? You're talking about you only need 113 Republicans to bring a bill to the floor, or 110 Republicans to bring a bill to the floor. Well, you could do that, right? You could make that choice. Like, a majority of our party supports this, let's just go ahead and put it on the floor and let's pass it with Democrats. That's an option and an alternative that today's environment is just not available, right? And we switched around in somewhere in the 2010s. We went from the Hastert rule to the Boehner rule, right? Where essentially you only pass bills with the majority party, right? And speakers have held true to this. They, if it's not an overwhelming majority of the majority party that's going to support this, they won't bring the bill to the floor. And it's really kind of raised the bar on the level of agreement within the party that needs to happen in order to vote on anything. And it's made it really hard to govern because that level of agreement is just not feasible in many cases. And so it's a choice that the party's leaders are making at the moment. It's a choice they feel that they have to make based on their membership. But it really is kind of at odds with most legislative history. We don't see this kind of like outright, like we're only going to use majority votes to pass legislation as frequently as we do today. It's really kind of odd in a lot of respects. So the leader, Speaker Johnson, could choose to bring other bills to the floor. The problem is he may instigate a motion to vacate. Right? He may upset his party so much that they're willing to toss him out over that kind of standard or those kinds of legislative practices. And that's, just indicative of the kind of partisan environment in which all of these legislators have grown up. They expect to govern on a partisan basis, when in reality, it's never really been that partisan, right? You still need to find bipartisan agreement in order to legislate, simply because the Senate exists, right? It's got totally different constituencies, and the filibuster still exists, right? Mostly. So it's really kind of difficult for leaders to govern, for the House to do anything when it's held to a standard that really doesn't conform with all of American history.
Yeah, it's sort of, yeah, you're putting a pretty unrealistic standard on things, and so reaching that consistently is really hard. And so I guess that maybe a good thing for us to close on is to talk a little bit about like what are sort of the larger consequences of the House struggling to govern itself, to produce, to actually pass legislation, to move things forward. What is that? How does that contribute, I guess, to the sort of larger governing picture in Washington?
Right. Well, unfortunately, it removes the House from a lot of decisions, right? When you have leaders that are actively stymieing legislation, actively like preventing the House from coming into session, simply because it would show disagreement or fracture within the majority, then you have a place where, the seat of democracy in the United States Congress is basically removing itself from the playing field to a significant degree. And that's not a great spot to be in, right? These constituencies are the ones that are closest to the people. This is the only institution at the founding that was directly connected to the popular vote. And it's a voice matters, right? These are the ones with the greatest electoral imperatives to weigh in on issues, to give the people what they want, because they're always going to be facing re-election in a year or two. And so that has a lot of consequences. And in some respects, you can kind of see them like not acting because they simply don't want to put out or don't want to oppose their president. In other cases, you can see them sort of just stymieing political negotiations because it might show division within the ranks, right? And at some point, you have to realize that the parties are not uniform, right? We still have a lot of really diverse representatives and diverse constituencies. A member from Oklahoma is going to have different interests and different concerns than one from California, right? Or one from Florida, or one from Maine, or one from Washington State. They have different interests, right? They are not uniform. Like somebody in Washington State is not going to be as interested in water rights as someone from the Southwest, right? It's just they have different realities. And we don't get to see those play out, or we don't appreciate them as much as we used to. And so it really is a shame, because it kind of like it takes all of the diversity of this country and flattens it into two kind of stereotypes, which don't really fit the parties at all. And so it's unfortunate that we're not seeing the House show its voice more or have its voice heard more, because those constituencies and those differences do matter on a day-to-day basis. And they matter for governing, right? So it's unfortunate that it's removed itself from the playing field significantly as parties try to sort of fit policymaking into this partisan frame. And it's a disservice to representation in a lot of ways. A lot of that's difficult because we don't have like local newspapers and a lot of the kind of like local entities that used to give those unique local characteristics to politics anymore. Contrary to what Tip O'Neill said, all politics is not that local anymore.
Pretty nationalized now.
It's
Yeah.
pretty national, right? It is unfortunate because despite the fact that everything is very national now, those members still do struggle with local differences, right? It's not like they've gone away. It's just that they're getting less voice within the House of Representatives. And when the House doesn't act, you're giving it even less voice as well. So it does have ramifications for representation and for the deliberation of politics, generally speaking.
Do you think, I mean, just obviously in this particular moment with President Trump, obviously, I think pushing at the sort of the edges of executive power, and at the same time, the House traditionally is the starting point for spending bills. That's they are constitutionally given that that power essentially. But is the Senate actually doing more of the hard work of figuring that stuff out, and the House is sort of signing off? So I was curious if sort of within Congress and then within in Washington and national policy making, what the consequences of like the weakened House has been.
Well, this is like a perfect encapsulation of the problems going on in the House. The Senate is getting things done, right? They are doing more than the House, but it's not the House Appropriations Committee's fault. Right? They've come to agreement on a lot of this stuff. They're reporting bills like we've got an agreement, right? You can hear Tom Cole. We've got an agreement over there. We're going to send it to the floor, and then it comes to the floor and it just gets crushed under the weight of partisan demands, right? And an unwillingness to cede any ground. So the committees are working, right? And the committees continue to work. It's just that the committee work never actually makes it to the floor in the House these days. Or when it does make it to the floor, it has to get pulled or it loses a special rule or something like that. So floor politics and committee politics are really at odds with one another at times, especially in the case of appropriations. And when the floor is jammed up as much as it is right now in the House, and the Committee on Appropriations can't bring bills to the floor and pass them over to the Senate, well, they have to wait for the Senate to deliver something for them so that they can go ahead and pass that in more intense pressure, right? So it has become, it's really kind of stymied everything. And it's indicative of like, you can see how politics in the House could work. It just doesn't work in the partisan frame in which they're trying to jam these things into. And it's inconvenient because a lot of members want that partisan frame to work and they're kind of willing to stymie all activity to do it. But the reality is, again, if you didn't have a speaker who was at the fulcrum of all this, things would sort of loosen up a little bit. Doesn't mean that it would work all that great or it would be any better necessarily, but you could kind of see more things happen than maybe what we're seeing today.
Fascinating. Well, this has been wonderful. Joshua Huder, Senior Fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University. You should check out his Substack, The Seat of Democracy. He's obviously, if you've been listening to this podcast, he knows quite a bit about the sort of institutional history and development of the United States Congress and the United States House of Representatives. And it's really fascinating to sort of track those changes over time and to make comparisons with the past, but also understand that changing politics and the institutions change. So sort of those things, you have all this change kind of going on at the same time, and sometimes it interacts in a way that can produce kind of an ungovernable body, or at least at the moment, an ungovernable body. So Josh, thank you so much for spending some time talking over the mess in the House with us.
Of course, it was fun. Thanks for having me, Jeffrey.
Absolutely. Well, again, I'm Jeffrey Skelly, the Chief Elections Analyst at Decision Desk HQ. Thanks so much for watching or listening, and we'll be back next week with more. So thanks again.